Hello, everybody. My name is Jacek Bartosiak. Welcome to Strategy and Future. And today my guest is Ian Bremmer, a political scientist, the president of Eurasia Group, a prominent speaker and prominent and knowledgeable person on Eurasia, as the name of the institution suggests, whom I have heard many times on different occasions in different venues. That's why I was looking forward to having this conversation. Hello, Ian.
Hey, good to be with you.
Okay, so let's get started. We are recording our conversation on the 1st of August, 2022. And I'm emphasizing this date because, things are happening across Eurasia. And this is exactly what we're going to talk about. So what would you focus on to start this conversation? So the ball is in your hands.
Let's focus on the fact that we are very unfortunately now in a new Cold War with the wealthy democracies of the world arrayed against Russia. I think that's bad for the planet. I'm deeply sorry that it is the case. I think a lot of us has hoped it wouldn't come to that. I also recognize that because of the actions taken by Putin a few months ago, we now have a few 100 million people on the planet. So let's say 5% of the world's population that are truly going to hate each other for generations in ways that were completely unnecessary. And, given how fragile what we live on is, really, that's pretty depressing news.
And how could it have developed in a different way? I understand that you talk about some sort of reconciling Russia into the world system, doing something about Russia that would, evade us going into, the war. So how would you, how think that things could have been played out differently?
One point is that after the Soviet Union collapsed, the interest in the West in integrating a large number of former Eastern Bloc countries into Western security architecture, NATO, into Western economic architecture, the EU, did not really include Russia. And it wasn't an effort to destroy Russia, it wasn't an effort to pick Russia apart, but it was a benign indifference to Russia's long-term trajectory. And the Americans and Europeans seen the events of 1989 to 1991 as an extraordinary and unique opportunity to integrate Russia into the world, or at least try into the Western order. I think that there could have been a lot more success there. So that's one thing that could have gone very differently. A second thing that could have gone very differently is Putin's own kleptocracy, his willingness to consolidate and align power for his own benefit at the expense of the Russian people. And that's deeply unfortunate. As we see, individual leaders do matter on the global stage, no matter how much we talk about structural forces. And Putin has been a revisionist and malevolent force, not so much for the world order, but for his own people. And I think that's truly unfortunate. And I think that, of course, the Ukrainians are now facing the worst of that.
Okay, let's assume that is the case. And don't you think that?
Well, we don't have to assume that's the case. You can say that something else is the case if you want. I mean, I'm more than happy to have whatever conversation you'd like, Jacek.
Yeah, don't you think that the real elephant in the room is China, and not even China itself, but the rise of China, that is creating this lack of equilibrium of agency across Eurasia. And Russia simply decided to use this occasion to, to adjust itself and to find a good place for the years to come in the new order that is being shaped anyway across Eurasia in terms of strategic flows, energy, markets, and so on. So continental consolidation, as we put it in Poland.
I don't see it that way. I agree with you that the rise of China from a global perspective is, of course, the single most dramatic transformation that we've seen in the last 50 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I accept that. But of course, China is much more economically powerful than Russia. The demographic reality of China in Siberia is something that the Russians have been very deeply concerned about. Chinese increasing influence over dominance in Central Asia, for example, both the so-called stands and also Pakistan is something that Russia's very deeply concerned about. I do think that Putin's worldview is in many ways aligned with China's before he invaded Ukraine, in the sense that the Russians see themselves as contained in Europe by the West in a similar way to how the Chinese see themselves as increasingly attempted to be contained in Asia by the West. I accept that. But that doesn't mean that there's a fundamental alliance between these two countries. I think China views Russia as much more transactional in that regard. And to the extent that Putin thought that here was an opportunity to cement Beijing as an ally, that's a huge misjudgment. By the way, I'm sure you've just seen in the last week that the Chinese have now ended all Belt and Road investment into Russia. And they've done that in part because they're concerned about secondary sanctions from the United States. Russia is being forcibly decoupled from the G7 economies. That's not happened in China, and China doesn't want to be tarred with that brush because, of course, China really needs continued integration with the global economy, and as a consequence is a much less revisionist global power than Russia is. So again, I'm not in Putin's head, and there are lots of theories out there as to why he decided to make the move on the 24th that he did, some of which involved China, some of which involved the failures in Afghanistan, some of which involved the heightened amount of leverage that was going to go away in terms of energy in Europe. Some of it involves how he perceived Biden. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I know how to weight those things in Putin's head. But to the extent that his decision-making was on the basis of a sense that now it's time for us to align with the Chinese, that would have been a really bad decision to make.
That is very interesting what you're saying, especially that, across Europe, increasingly we see things as Eurasia consolidating against the world ocean, put it in the grand scheme of things, in terms how you create markets, how the capital moves, in terms of overlapping agencies, and so on and so forth. So it is increasingly so it is interesting to see that you see this sort of the gap of interest, sort of the rift of interest between China and Russia. And I comply. I think that I concur with your assessment. And now the question: let's try to predict the future. What's going to happen? And maybe let's talk along those lines of trying to forecast the future. If you say that China is not a revisionist power because it gains power from the existing system order of trade, and Russia is a revisionist power because it was on the side of the system, and couldn't make a deal with, for example, this pan-European system from Vladivostok to Lisbon thing because of the American presence in Europe. And who are the Europeans, the Western Europeans? Are they if we take it, as a sum, are they first of all, in grasp of the reality that the summer weather has ended, and now they need to wake up to geopolitics and make a decision whether they are part of Eurasia or they are part of the transatlantic system? And the most important question, whether the United States, since Donald Trump, is really a status quo power or revisionist power that wants to remodel the world system to sort of strangle China, to stop China.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting, since you're putting it in this frame of revisionism versus status quo, let me be a little bit more nuanced than that. Mm-hmm. Because again, I do believe that on February 4th, which is back when Putin and Xi Jinping met in Beijing and made that big announcement on their global friendship without limits, that there was a perception of aligned worldview, as I just described. I would say that since then, and since Putin's really horribly misguided decision to invade all of Ukraine and attempt to overthrow the Zelensky regime, that actually Putin has become a revisionist to revolutionary power, and that when he went to visit President Raisi in Tehran, I think his first trip outside the country since the invasion on February 24th, actually Russia has gone to being most aligned with Iran today, because Iran is also a medium power that has been completely decoupled from the G7. It's become a pariah for the international community of advanced industrial democracies. So has Russia. Such a shocking thing to have had occur over the course of 30 years. Very few people would have predicted that Russia would follow that trajectory. So if Russia and Iran are on the spectrum from revisionist to revolutionary, I would say that the United States and China are both on the spectrum of status quo to revisionist. There's a spectrum, right? And different countries and different leaders in different countries fall in different places along that spectrum. And Trump is more of a revisionist US leader than Biden. Biden is more status quo. Xi Jinping is more of a revisionist leader in China than his predecessors, but China is still much more pro-status quo given its present environment than the Russians certainly are or will be. Where are the Europeans? The Europeans are actually increasingly being driven by the EU. The European Union is a stronger supranational organization today because of the pandemic and because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and because of climate change. These three different crises that are impacting the world in very different ways have all led the Europeans to recognize that they need a strong EU. They need better defense capabilities, better healthcare capabilities, better redistribution of wealth from the wealthy countries to the poorer countries. And frankly, I wish the Americans understood and recognized that the EU, a strong EU in this geopolitical environment, is clearly in America's interests, no matter who you are. And 30, 40, 50 years ago, a lot of Americans weren't sure if they wanted a strong EU or a weak EU, weren't sure if they wanted an EU that was going to hedge against them or push back on some American policies. But with the realities of China and Russia and a number of rogue governments and non-governmental organizations that increasingly have a lot of room to play in, whether it's North Korea or Pakistan or cyber criminals or you name it, ISIS, the fact is that, and a United States that is not prepared to do as much of the lifting, on being the global policeman or the architect of global trade and provide access to the US market to other countries, you need a stronger EU, and the European is obliging. The European Union is becoming stronger. And indeed, if you look at the impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, certainly the strengthening of NATO is a very important implication of it. But the most important change, in my view, was the decision, the unanimous decision of the European Union to accept Ukraine and Moldova as candidate members. The decision of all 27 European Union states to embrace that Russia's war in Ukraine is a European war, is a war against a European state. And therefore, they are obligated to help defend Ukraine. They are obligated to help rebuild Ukraine. I think that's a very big deal. And it will have generational impact in how we think about the future of Eurasia.
Oh, this time I beg to differ, if you don't mind.
Sure.
In as much as I agree with you that it is currently in the interest of the United States to support existence of the European Union, as opposed to many decades before, when the United States always wanted to create proper equilibrium for itself across Eurasia. But with the rise of China, they simply need to have consolidated Europe, because China is too big a cake, to be swallowed. To be taken on by the United States itself. And I fully agree with this part of the assessment. But but the hell is made of good intentions, and this is the history of Europe. And I think that the war in Ukraine shows it, especially if you see things from the intermarium countries where I am sitting as I speak now. The EU is simply in shatters. First of all, it doesn't work. It completely doesn't service security. At all. It doesn't provide anything in terms of security. It's completely toothless. That's number one. From the Polish perspective, Lithuanian perspective, countries here. And this is really an acute issue. The second thing is apparently structural interests of Germany are completely different from those of Poland and other countries on the continent. And apparently the Germans were not fair, and they were trying to build their own power position based on the cooperation with the Russians. And if they don't address it properly, nothing will force Poland to accept the existence of EU in the model. Nothing. I've been always a very pro-EU guy, but I came back from the streets of Warsaw. Okay, so that's what you feel, because war changes everything. Energy dependence is showing weakness of EU like crazy. The countries, if you take a look at the opinions of different people, there is an anti-German resentment from Portugal across France, everywhere. Plus, the entry of Sweden and Finland into NATO is strengthening US position in Europe, and is weakening the German position in Europe. It boils down to a very simple assessment. Germany is too little, too small to force its hand in Europe. And that's why EU will go. It will be very difficult to have a EU given the crisis and given the difference of opinions what Russia is. For Poles, Russia should be out of the European system of balance.
Yeah.
And for Germans, they should be in.
So again, I don't actually disagree with what you just said, but let me explain why I would frame it differently. Because I certainly agree that the differences between the German and Polish position today on security are massive, and frankly, on energy are real and significant. But the fact that Germany's position in the EU is getting weaker doesn't mean to me that that's because the United States is driving everything. It means to me that you have a bunch of comparatively weak EU central governments and EU superstructure that is becoming more significant. When I look at global climate change, I see the EU as way out in front in its regulatory and rule-setting capacity and increasingly other countries in the world that want access to the EU as the world's largest common market, aligning with the EU on technology, on data, on privacy. The EU doesn't have any of the companies, but they're setting the rules that increasingly other countries and companies are aligning with around the world. None of that was happening before. Now, you mentioned that the EU is toothless on defense, and I agree with that. That's been true for decades. By the way, I think that the trajectory of EU spend on defense is significantly greater and has become significantly greater because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now, France and Macron's position on strategic autonomy, which had been more about we need to build up the EU defense because we can't count on the Americans, has increasingly morphed into we need to build a more sustainable EU defense capability precisely so we can hold up more of our end of the bargain with and for the Americans. That is a shift that is going on, and I think that makes NATO stronger. I happen to see the global security order as very much still a US-driven security order with some regional powers that are trying to subvert it, China being one, but China's not a global security power and isn't close to being one. Russia is increasingly only going to be a regional security power, with the exception of unusable nukes, because their military capabilities are both being expended and because their ability to create any more is being unwound. So when I think about where we're going to be in another 10 years, I actually see comparatively weak EU governments, individual European governments, and certainly big differences between the Lithuanians, the Poles on the one side, and say the Germans, the Italians on the other. But I see a stronger EU superstructure that matters and will particularly matter because the Americans will not be as capable of consistent rule setting and legislation from one administration to the next. So, I mean, you and I might disagree in 10% of the policy description that we just went through, but the difference here is mostly on frame. It's not on whether or not the EU matters.
Maybe you're right. Maybe you're right in this nuanced approach. But the key question is, I wonder what your answer would be to this question is, what is Russia for Europe? And in 10 years' time, where will be the place of Russia?
That's a good question.
In relation to Europe and EU.
So,
and in the context, of course, of this, ideas of the Europe from Vladivostok to Lisbon on this, energy consolidation.
I see. So here, I am comparatively optimistic about what is happening in the EU. I see now that the European Union has held together for 7 rounds of sanctions, far tougher than has ever been affected against any member of the G20 in history. No one would have expected the Europeans would have done that before the invasion. No one. I see the Europeans fully supporting the freezing of half of Russia's assets held outside of Russia, which no one thought the United States or Europe would be capable of doing before the invasion happened. That's now happened. Now, there's no question that the Europeans are still buying Russian energy, and the Russians see that as the most important point of leverage they have on the ground. And I fully expect that Russian gas to Europe, and especially to Germany, is going to be shut down before winter, because that's their point of maximum leverage. And they want to use that to see how much dissent against the punishment of Russia that they can stir up, how much of a peace movement they can stir up, how much division they can stir up inside the EU. And I'm sure there will be some. I'm sure there'll be pro-Russia demonstrations that we will see in European capitals this winter when people are suffering and when some of these economies are contracting by 2 or 3% or more. I mean, the IMF expects a 2 to 3% contraction of the entire EU an $18 trillion economy if the Russians cut off all their gas. That's a big deal. I am not trying to minimize that, but I do want to say that that leverage after this winter goes away. It's much less in 12 months' time. It barely exists in 24. And I think that that is a hugely big deal. Yes, there are exceptions for the Slovaks, exceptions for the Hungarians, but for the major European economies, that's what we're presently looking at. I think that's a really big deal. And I expect that, that the Europeans will hold together through this. I also think that the millions of Ukrainians that are living in the EU right now, particularly in Poland, of course, and not just in camps, but in communities, in people's homes, and not only in Poland, but across the European Union, I think really does mean something for the Europeans. I think that the Europeans have increasingly identified with Ukraine in this moment. And okay, they're not willing to do as much and sacrifice as much as the Ukrainian people would like, and I understand that. But honestly, they're doing a lot more than I think anyone would have honestly expected before the war had hit. And so I am ultimately more hopeful that the EU will hold together. And so to fully answer your question, what is Russia for the EU? I think Russia has increasingly become a pariah for the EU. I think Russia has become a country that the Europeans recognize they made a huge mistake in relying on the Russians for trade, for energy, for food, and that strategic mistake will be remedied. That I think this is a transformational moment.
I hope you're right, but given the behavior of the German politicians and the German government, it doesn't seem to be the case. Apparently, they want to wait out the crisis and make some sort of a deal with Russians.
I don't agree with that. I talk to the German government on a regular basis, and I see them moving as fast as humanly possible to get themselves out of dependency of energy from Russia on every front. And again, doing far more than anyone thought they could have at the beginning of the year. And I don't believe, of course, they'd love to see the conflict end. They'd love to see a freeze of the conflict, but I don't see them pressuring the Ukrainian government to accept that they have to lose a bunch of land in order to accomplish that. I don't see that from the Germans at all.
We will see in winter time, because it's not only
that's
about
right. No, yours is the key question. The Polish government and the Polish people are particularly skeptical of this. I get it. And the only thing I would ask you is to give the process, keep an open mind around the process, because I've been surprised with how much they're doing.
Yeah, why I'm saying is, let's see in winter what happens. It's not only about heating and the people and industry in winter. It's about the model of the social contract that was hinged upon the low price of energy. And that made it competitive on the global scale. Germans don't like to lose competitiveness. They will do all they can to keep their lifestyle, because it's all about lifestyles they have intact. And this is...
Look, the Germans also, really care about austerity. And yet when the pandemic hit, the Germans took the lead in ensuring that the wealthy, austere countries in Europe actually provided an enormous amount of cash, even to those lazy Greek ne'er-do-wells. And you remember in the 2009, 2010 Eurozone crisis, the German perspective on Greece was very different. So all I'm saying is I feel like we are in a bit of a different world right now.
Yeah, Ian, but you know that structurally Germans benefited from existence of EU and Euro as a currency. So it was not a sort of a dole, so to speak, So it doesn't work like it's only in accountants. That's the Germans profited a lot from both EU expansion and the structure of the trade and the structural flows, internal flows across the continent. So they are the largest beneficiary of this.
And yet they forced the Greeks to go through a depression that was worse that was worse than the American Depression to uphold their austerity. And I think they've learned lessons from the last 10 years. And they've particularly learned lessons because they didn't think the Russians were actually going to take this kind of a move, and now they have. For me, that Olaf Scholz speech early in the invasion, where he said we're spending 2% of German GDP on defense going forward, we're going to send weapons to support the Ukrainians. Again, they haven't done as much as the Americans. They haven't done as much as the Poles would like. But I thought that was a transformational speech. I really did.
Yeah, let's hope that this is going to be the case. For the time being, Polish government didn't believe in this transformation, and we decided to spend 5% of GDP on the military.
Yep.
If our government did believe that the EU would become a real geopolitical power with the military and spending and energy independence, we wouldn't invest so much money into it. Yeah, so that's, the money.
Well, you know what they say? They say hope for the best and prepare for the worst. I think that's useful policy, irrespective of how optimistic you are about this.
Yeah. And then the last thing I wanted to ask you is, what is your prediction in terms of the war in Ukraine itself? Will it sort of become a stalemate, a deadlock, and sometimes it will ebb away with some sort of a lukewarm deal, or it's just the beginning of the new Napoleonic Wars era across Eurasia with this equilibrium lost, trade wars, intellectual war, trade wars, capital wars, kinetic wars. What do you think? Well,
look, I mean, I'm not a military analyst, but the people I talk to in the White House and the people I talk to in NATO leadership tell me that they believe their best estimates are that it's a coin flip whether or not the Russians are going to be able to take all of the Donbass or not. Everyone knows that the Ukrainians will do some counterattacks. Maybe that gets them Kherson. But so that means that your expected outcome here is that the Russians are going to end up taking land from Ukraine that they had not occupied before February 24th. And their intention is to annex that territory and to make it part of Russia. Putin will certainly announce that as a win against the Ukrainians. And it is completely unacceptable as an outcome. The Ukrainians will not accept it, nor should they. And the West will not accept it, nor should they. And I think as a consequence of that, there will be no effective negotiations leading to a breakthrough with Russia. Those sanctions will remain. The Russian economy will be massively punished for the foreseeable future on the back of the war crimes and the aggression that they've committed. And that is not a 5% contraction of the Russian economy. That's Iran-like. It's a 30 to 50% contraction of the Russian economy over 5 to 10 years. It means that Russia will no longer be able to have advanced manufacturing. They won't be the second largest military exporter in the world. They will lose an immense amount of influence. And my worry is what happens when Russia is even more humiliated and under much more economic pressure with a stronger and expanded NATO, with more forward deployed troops. How does Putin or Putin's successor respond and react to that? This is a much more dangerous world that we will be living in on the back of Putin's illegitimate invasion. That's where I see the war going. It's worst, of course. I mean, the 44 million Ukrainians, every one of whom has suffered unspeakably from the actions over the last 5 months, and there's no way to make up for that. There's nothing we can do that can ever answer for those crimes. And yet the Russians will end up paying more because of the incredible, just the staggering misjudgment that Putin himself made.
Yeah, I sort of concur with your assessment about misjudgment and about the suffering that the losses that the Russians might face if this continues along the path you described. We will see. Maybe in the future, in the near future, I will manage to convince you to record another conversation, and we will check whether we have been, accurate in assessing.
We'll see where we go. But this was fun. I enjoyed chatting with you, and I appreciate the work you're doing out there. It seems intelligent and honest, and we need more of it. So thank you.
Thank you. Likewise, I really appreciate the conversation with you. Thank you very much. Ian Bremmer was our guest, Eurasia Group. You stay with us. Thank you very much.